I turned around and walked out the moment my son smirked at my breathing problems. The candles were already burning when I stepped through Evan's door. 5 of them, tall and white, lined across the dining table. The smell hit me like a wall. Vanilla, lavender, something chemical underneath that made my chest tighten immediately. Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe, hit the hype button, and like the video. It really helps the channel grow. And tell us in the comments, what would you do in this situation? Troy, you made it. Marissa appeared from the kitchen, smiling that smile that never reached her eyes. Dinner's almost ready. I stood in the doorway, my coat still on. The scent was already working into my lungs, that familiar tightness building. I'd told them about this, more than once. Hey, Dad. Evan appeared behind his wife. My son, 33 years old, and looking at me like I was some puzzle he'd stopped trying to solve. The candles, I said quietly. Could we put those out? Marissa's smile froze. She glanced at Evan, then back at me. They're just candles, Troy. They make the room nice. I know, but the scent, it bothers my breathing. You remember I mentioned that. She rolled her eyes. Actually rolled them right there in front of me. It's not that strong. We can barely smell them. I can. My voice stayed level. Years of practice. It's the chemicals in the fragrance. They trigger my respiratory sensitivity. From the plant. Dad. Evan's tone had shifted. Not quite annoyed, but close. Come on, it's just dinner. We haven't seen you in weeks. Kara was already seated at the table with Sage. My daughter looked uncomfortable, but she said nothing. She never did. Please, I said. Just put them out. Oh my God. Marissa turned to Evan. Is he serious right now? Evan's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but almost. Like he was trying not to laugh at me asking to breathe properly in his home. That's when I knew. I turned around. Troy? Dad, where are you going? Kara's voice, finally. Too little, too late. Home. Are you kidding me? Marissa's voice followed me down the hall. He's leaving because of candles? Evan, your father is leaving because of candles. The cold air outside felt like mercy. I stood on their front step, just breathing, feeling my lungs start to ease. My truck was parked at the curb, patient and reliable. My phone buzzed. Text from Kara. Dad, please come back. We can work this out. I slid the phone into my pocket without responding and drove home. My apartment was quiet. Clean. Simple. I hung up my coat, made coffee, and sat at my small kitchen table. 26 years I'd worked at that chemical plant. 26 years breathing in things that were slowly destroying my lungs. I'd done it to provide for them. For Evan, mainly. College, down payments. Every emergency. And now he smirked when I asked them to put out some candles. The phone rang. Evan. I let it go to voicemail. Then Marissa called. I turned the phone off completely. The files were in the closet, in a cardboard box I hadn't opened in years. Medical records from the plant, safety reports, incident logs, things I'd kept because some part of me knew I might need them someday. Now I could imagine why. I pulled the box out and set it on my bed. Inside were folders, medical reports, incident documentation, exposure assessments, safety violations, a complete record of my time in Building C. I started sorting through them, report after report, date after date, a timeline of exposure, of ignored safety protocols, of warnings that went unheeded. My phone, still powered off, sat on the nightstand. Let them call, let them wonder. I had work to do. The memories came in fragments while I sat there with those files spread across my bed, each document a small window into a past I'd tried hard not to dwell on. 1998. Evan was 11. The plant had just implemented new production procedures. Faster, more efficient, management said. They didn't mention the ventilation problems until people started getting headaches. I'd been there 17 years by then, long enough to know when something wasn't right, long enough to recognize the signs of trouble. But you didn't complain, not if you wanted to keep your job, not if you had a kid depending on you, a mortgage to pay, a life to maintain. I remembered coming home with my throat raw, my eyes burning like I'd been staring into smoke. Evan had asked me if I was sick. I'd told him I was fine, just tired. Lying came easy when it was for a good reason, when it was to protect him from worrying about whether his father's job was safe, whether the money would keep coming. The incident report from that month was brief. Minor ventilation irregularity in Building C, temporary increase in ambient chemical concentration, corrected within acceptable time frame. Acceptable to who? I'd wondered then. Not to the 12 people who'd gone home with burning throats and pounding headaches. 2003. The first real incident: chemical leak in Building C during the night shift. They evacuated us for 6 hours while they assessed the situation, which meant while they figured out how to minimize the paperwork. Then they sent us back in with paper masks, thin paper masks for chemical exposure that required respirators. I still had the incident report, filed it away with all the others. The supervisor had pulled me aside afterward and said, "You seem concerned about this, Troy. Should we be worried?" Translation: keep quiet or find another job. I'd kept quiet. Evan was in high school by then. College was coming up fast, and state university tuition wasn't cheap even with financial aid. Someone had to pay for textbooks, housing, meal plans, all those expenses that added up. Someone had to be reliable. I pulled out another file, medical records from 2007. The cough that wouldn't go away, no matter what over-the-counter medicine I tried. 3 weeks of it before I finally went to the doctor, and even then only because the supervisor said I was disturbing other workers. The doctor ran tests, asked detailed questions about my work environment, frowned at the results, and wrote occupational exposure in my chart. He'd recommended I consider changing jobs. I was 41 years old, no college degree, a son who needed tuition money for his sophomore year, a car that needed new transmission, a roof that was starting to leak. Changing jobs wasn't an option, so I'd bought an inhaler and learned to live with the constant tickle in my throat, the way my chest tightened on cold mornings, the cough that showed up whenever I laughed too hard. Evan graduated in 2010. I'd been so proud at that ceremony, watching him walk across the stage in that ridiculous cap and gown, his face lit up with achievement. 4 years of state university, paid for with overtime shifts and breathing in whatever the plant management decided was acceptable that day. Every extra hour I worked, every Saturday I gave up, every vacation day I sold back. It all went toward making sure he had what he needed. He'd thanked me in his speech, said I was the best father he could ask for, the one who'd sacrificed to give him opportunities. The whole auditorium had applauded. I'd sat there with my damaged lungs and felt like it was all worth it. I wondered if he remembered that now, if he thought about it when he smirked at my breathing problems. The respiratory clinic visits started getting more frequent after 2012. The doctor's notes got more serious, more urgent. Patient shows clear signs of chronic occupational exposure, progressive deterioration of respiratory function, recommend immediate workplace assessment and removal from source. But I'd already given them everything, 24 years by then. What was I supposed to do? Start over at 50? Learn a new trade? Compete with people half my age for entry-level positions? I'd toughed it out another 2 years before finally taking early retirement. Medical necessity, they'd called it. I called it consequences. Consequences of 2.5 decades breathing air that should have been filtered properly but wasn't. Consequences of management deciding productivity was more important than worker safety. Consequences of my own choices. Staying when I should have left, accepting conditions I should have refused, prioritizing my son's future over my own health. But the money had kept coming even after retirement. Even after Evan had his degree and his job at the engineering firm. Even after he'd supposedly become independent, the requests kept coming. Can you help with the down payment on the condo? Can you cover this month's rent while I sort out the promotion situation? The car needs work, and I'm between paychecks. Marissa wants to renovate the kitchen, and we're a bit short. I'd helped every time. What else was a father supposed to do? You don't turn your back on your kids just because they're technically adults. You help when help is needed. Except somewhere along the way, help had become expectation. Somewhere along the way, Evan had stopped seeing my assistance as generosity and started seeing it as obligation. My obligation to him, but apparently not his obligation to show me basic respect in return. My phone, still powered off, had probably collected a dozen more messages by now. I left it that way and kept reading through the files. 2015, my last year at the plant. The medical retirement paperwork was extensive. Forms documenting the extent of my respiratory damage, the specific causative factors, the progressive nature of the condition. A doctor's letter stating I could no longer safely work in environments with chemical exposure. Union representation ensuring I got the benefits I was entitled to. And through it all, the constant thought, will this be enough? Will the retirement income cover everything? It had been enough. Barely. I'd learned to budget carefully, cut unnecessary expenses, live simply. But there wasn't room for the kind of financial help Evan had grown accustomed to. I'd tried explaining that to him, tried saying the words, I can't keep supporting you like before. I'm on a fixed income now. He'd said he understood. Then 2 months later, he was asking for money again. The cafe on Elm Street was quiet the next morning. Friday, 8:30. Early enough that the breakfast crowd had mostly cleared out, late enough that I'd had time to organize my thoughts. I sat in my usual corner booth with weak coffee and the newspaper I'd picked up outside. The place smelled like toast and burnt coffee grounds, real smells, organic compounds that my lungs could handle. No artificial fragrances, no synthetic scents designed to mask reality with something more pleasant. I wasn't really reading the paper, just needed to be somewhere that wasn't my apartment, somewhere I could think without staring at those files, somewhere public enough that I felt connected to the world but anonymous enough that nobody would bother me. Troy? I looked up. Owen Granger stood by my table, coffee in hand, that familiar, concerned expression on his weathered face. We'd worked together for 15 years before he moved to safety inspection. Good man, honest, the kind who actually cared about the rules being followed because he'd seen what happened when they weren't. Owen, haven't seen you in a while. Mind if I sit? I gestured to the empty seat. He sat down slowly, like he was working up to something difficult. I heard about the dinner, he said finally. Of course he had. That's how it worked in families, in small towns, in interconnected lives. Everyone knew everything, and nobody did anything about it. They just talked about it over coffee and shook their heads and said, "That's too bad," before moving on with their day. News travels fast. Kara called me last night. Asked if I knew where you were. Sounded worried. He paused. Said you walked out. That Marissa lit those scented candles even after you asked her not to. She did. That's not right, Troy. They know about your condition. They've known for years. They know. They just don't care. The words came out flat. Not angry, not bitter. Just factual. A statement of observable reality. Owen looked down at his coffee, uncomfortable. Nobody liked hearing the truth said out loud like that. It was easier to pretend families were complicated, situations were nuanced, everyone meant well, even when they acted badly. Your son should stand up for you, he said quietly. That's what family does. My son thinks I'm being dramatic. His wife agrees with him. That's the reality. What are you going to do? Good question. I'd spent all night sorting through files, all morning sitting in this cafe trying to figure out exactly that. What do you do when your family decides you're expendable? When they have taken everything you gave them and responded by treating your legitimate needs as inconvenient preferences? I don't know yet, I said, but I know I'm done being treated like I'm making things up. Owen nodded slowly, that thoughtful expression I remembered from our days working together. He'd always been the careful one, the one who thought things through before acting. Those old plant records, the ones that show the exposure levels we were really dealing with. You remember those? I've got copies in my files at home. I've got more, from the safety office. Logs that never made it into the official reports. He paused, watching me carefully. Internal documentation that shows what management knew and when they knew it. Exposure readings that were conveniently left out of the reports they sent to OSHA. I looked at him carefully. Why would I need those? I don't know, but if you do, you know where to find me. He stood up, leaving his coffee half finished. Take care of yourself, Troy, and don't let them make you feel like you're the problem. You're not. You never were. After he left, I sat there for another hour. The cafe filled up with the mid-morning crowd, then emptied out again. Business people grabbing coffee between meetings, retirees passing the time, a young mother with a baby in a stroller, looking exhausted and grateful for 5 minutes of sitting down. Normal lives, normal problems, nobody dealing with families who'd decided their medical conditions were personality flaws. My phone was still off. I had no intention of turning it back on today. Maybe not tomorrow either. Let them wonder. Let them worry. Let them experience what it was like when someone you expected to always be available suddenly wasn't. That night, back in my apartment, I returned to the files with new purpose. This time, I wasn't just sorting. I was organizing, creating a timeline, matching incident reports with medical visits, safety violations with respiratory problems, management decisions with worker consequences. A pattern emerged, clear and undeniable. 1997, new production process implemented. Ventilation system not upgraded. First complaints of eye irritation and headaches. 1998, ventilation problems continue. Management memo, which I'd kept a copy of, noting acceptable level of worker discomfort during transition period. 2001, chemical exposure incident. Workers sent home, returned to work next day, no follow-up assessment. 2003, major leak, 6-hour evacuation, inadequate protective equipment provided upon return. 2005, my first serious respiratory symptoms. Doctor's visit. Occupational exposure noted in medical records. 2007, persistent cough. Reduced lung capacity. Doctor recommends workplace change. I stay because Evan needs college money. 2010, Evan graduates. My respiratory function continues declining. 2012, multiple respiratory infections. Doctor's notes becoming more urgent. Patient should not continue in current workplace. 2014, severe bronchial episode. Emergency room visit. Diagnosis, chronic occupational respiratory syndrome. 2015, medical retirement. Permanent damage confirmed. The timeline told a story of gradual destruction, of choices made and prices paid, a story of priorities. My son's future over my health, his opportunities over my lungs, and now, when I needed the smallest consideration, the tiniest acknowledgement that my sacrifice had consequences, they rolled their eyes and smirked. I closed the last file and stacked everything neatly. The apartment was quiet around me, just the refrigerator humming and the occasional car passing on the street below. Quiet and orderly, the way I'd learned to keep things, everything in its place, everything under control. My daughter's voice echoed in my head from that text message. Dad, please come back. We can work this out. But working it out required them to acknowledge there was a problem, and they'd made it clear they wouldn't do that. To them, I was the problem. Too sensitive, too demanding, too focused on myself. The fact that I had legitimate medical issues backed by documentation didn't matter. What mattered was that I was inconveniencing them. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the parking lot was mostly empty. A few cars under the streetlights, shadows and silence. My truck sat in its usual spot, waiting patiently. Tomorrow I'd take the next step, whatever that was. Tonight, I'd let the reality settle. Let myself really understand what had been confirmed at that dinner. My family didn't respect me, maybe they never had, maybe I'd just been too useful to notice. I turned off the lights and went to bed. The files sat on my kitchen table, organized and ready, evidence of everything they'd chosen to ignore. The downtown plaza was busy at noon on a Friday. I sat on a bench near the fountain, my coat collar turned up against the October wind that smelled like rain and fallen leaves. People moved past in clusters, office workers on lunch break, their conversations a blur of deadlines and weekend plans. Mothers with strollers navigating the uneven pavement. Teenagers cutting class, thinking they were getting away with something. Anonymous faces, anonymous lives. Everyone moving through their own small dramas, unaware of anyone else's. Then I heard Evan's voice. Oh, I looked up. He was standing maybe 30 feet away, near the coffee cart, talking to someone I didn't recognize. A woman in business attire, maybe a coworker from the engineering firm. Marissa was with him, her arm looped through his in that possessive way she had, laughing at something, that bright, performative laugh she used in public. I stayed where I was. They hadn't seen me. I was just another old man on a bench, invisible in the way older people become in crowds. I swear to God, Marissa was saying, loud enough to carry across the plaza. He walked out because of candles. Actual candles, like a child throwing a tantrum. The other woman made a sympathetic noise. Oh no, that must have been so awkward. You have no idea. I spent all afternoon making this perfect dinner, trying to bring everyone together, and he ruins it over scented candles. I mean, who does that? My father's always been dramatic about stuff like that, Evan said, his voice carrying that casual dismissiveness I'd heard so often lately. Everything's a crisis with him. Every little thing becomes this big deal. He claimed he couldn't breathe. Marissa rolled her eyes, the gesture exaggerated for her audience. There were 5 candles in a whole dining room. 5 little candles. But apparently that's too much for him to handle. The woman looked appropriately concerned. Does he have allergies or something? He says he has this respiratory condition from working at a chemical plant, Evan said. And yeah, maybe he does have some sensitivity. But come on. He acts like every smell is going to take him out. Most people who worked at that plant don't make such a big deal about it. He gets like this sometimes, Evan continued. Makes everything about him. We're all trying to have a nice family dinner, and he has to center the whole evening around his issues. They got their coffee and started walking toward the office buildings on the far side of the plaza. I watched them go, Marissa still talking, Evan nodding along, turning his father's medical condition into lunch break entertainment. I sat there for another 10 minutes, letting the cold seep through my coat. The fountain behind me gurgled steadily, water circulating in its endless loop. Pigeons gathered near a trash can, fighting over someone's discarded sandwich. Everything about him. Makes everything about him. 26 years in a chemical plant. Lungs permanently damaged. Early medical retirement because my body couldn't take it anymore. And to them, I was being dramatic, making everything about myself. I pulled out my phone. I'd turned it back on that morning just to check if there was anything urgent, and saw 17 missed calls, 4 voicemails, 12 texts, all from Kara, Evan, and Marissa. The messages ranged from concerned to annoyed to demanding. Kara: Dad, please call me back. I know you're upset, but we need to talk about this. We're family. Evan: You overreacted at dinner. This is getting ridiculous. Call me. Marissa: This is so uncomfortable for everyone. You're making people worry for no reason. Please just apologize so we can move past this. I deleted them all without responding, one by one, watching each message disappear. Then I turned the phone off again. The park bench 3 blocks away was quieter. Less traffic, fewer people. Just the lake and the ducks and the bare trees losing their last leaves to the wind. I sat down and looked at the water, gray under the overcast sky. A few ducks floated near the shore, unbothered by the weather or anything else. Simple lives, simple needs. What do you do when your family decides you're expendable? The question wasn't rhetorical anymore. It wasn't philosophical. It was practical, immediate, demanding an actual answer. I'd spent decades being the reliable one, the one who showed up, the one who helped when help was needed, the one who took the overtime shifts and breathed the chemical air so they could have what they wanted. College for Evan. A wedding that Marissa's parents couldn't fully pay for. Down payments and emergency loans and, just until I get back on my feet, money that never got paid back. And the moment I needed basic consideration, not money, not sacrifice, just basic acknowledgement that my medical condition was real, I became the problem, the difficult one, the dramatic one who made everything about himself. I thought about those files in my apartment, incident reports showing repeated ventilation failures, medical records documenting progressive respiratory damage, each visit showing worse results than the last, safety violations that were filed away and forgotten by management but carefully kept by workers who knew someday they might need proof, a paper trail of everything they'd put me through at that plant. And then I thought about the other documents, bank statements showing every check I'd written to Evan over the years, every loan I'd co-signed, putting my credit on the line when his wasn't good enough, every emergency I'd covered when he called saying he needed help. Numbers that added up to a substantial amount. More than I'd initially realized when I started going through the records. He'd never paid any of it back. Never even acknowledged it as something that needed to be paid back. It was just what fathers did, right? Help their kids, support them, and be there when they needed you. Except kids were supposed to become adults eventually. Adults who understood that consideration went both ways. Adults who recognized sacrifice when they saw it and responded with gratitude instead of eye-rolling dismissal. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Even turned off, it seemed to have a phantom vibration, my brain so conditioned to expect calls that it created them when they weren't there. I pulled it out and looked at the dark screen. Another text from Kara. Dad, I talked to Evan. He says he didn't mean to upset you. He's willing to apologize if you'll just call back. Can we all sit down and talk about this like adults? He didn't mean to upset me. As if the problem was my reaction, not their behavior. As if I'd misunderstood their intentions when they lit those candles, smirked at my discomfort, and then turned my medical condition into a joke at a downtown coffee cart. I looked at the message for a long time. The ducks drifted past, leaving small wakes in the gray water. A jogger passed behind me, breathing hard, earbuds in. The world kept moving while I sat there deciding what to do with the rest of my life. Finally, I typed, I need some space right now. Don't call for a while. Her response came immediately. How much space? A few days? A week? When can we see you? I don't know yet. I'll reach out when I'm ready. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, you're scaring me, Dad. This isn't like you. That almost made me laugh. It wasn't like me. That was the problem, wasn't it? I'd spent so long being the reliable, accommodating, never-make-waves father that any deviation from that pattern was frightening. Any assertion of my own needs was treated as a crisis. I put the phone away and watched the ducks. They had it simple. Swim, eat, survive. No complicated family dynamics. No subtle humiliations disguised as normal interaction. No one questioning whether their needs were legitimate or just dramatic overreactions. The wind picked up, sending ripples across the water and making me pull my coat tighter. I'd retired at 54, 2 years ago now. Early enough that I had time left, but late enough that my body had already paid the price. The doctor's last assessment had been clear. Permanent damage, manageable with medication and lifestyle changes. Avoid chemical exposure. Avoid situations that stress the respiratory system. Monitor for infections. Accept that your lung capacity will never be what it was. Avoid scented candles in enclosed spaces. I'd explained this to them, multiple times, in detail, used the doctor's exact words, brought them printed information about reactive airways syndrome, made sure they understood this wasn't a preference or a quirk, this was a diagnosed medical condition with specific triggers and predictable consequences. And they'd responded by rolling their eyes and telling me I was making everything about myself. Maybe I'd been too understanding for too long. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe by always accommodating, always being flexible, always putting their comfort before my needs, I'd taught them that my needs didn't matter, that they were optional, negotiable, something to be taken seriously only when it was convenient for them. My phone buzzed again, actually buzzed this time, not phantom vibration, not a text, a voicemail notification from a number I didn't recognize. I almost deleted it unheard, but something made me listen. Mr. Renwick, this is Judith Collins from the Regional Plant Safety Records Office. Owen Granger asked me to call. We have some documentation regarding exposure incidents from your time in Building C that might be relevant to your medical situation. If you'd like copies for your records, please call back at your convenience. This is regarding incidents logged between 1997 and 2015. I saved the voicemail and sat there thinking. Owen had said he had more records, logs that never made it into the official reports, documentation showing what management knew and when they knew it. Proof that the conditions I'd worked in weren't just unfortunate circumstances, but the result of deliberate choices. Choices to prioritize production over safety, efficiency over worker health. He'd offered them if I ever needed them. I was starting to think I might need them. The question was, what did I plan to do with them? Show them to my family? Make them understand that my condition was real? That it had real causes? That I wasn't being dramatic or difficult? Would that even matter? Would evidence change minds that had already decided I was the problem? I didn't have a complete answer yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was tired of being dismissed, tired of being treated like my health problems were personality flaws, tired of watching my son choose his wife's eye-rolling over his father's legitimate needs, tired of being expected to be understanding while receiving no understanding in return. The ducks took flight suddenly, wings beating hard against the cold air, water streaming from their bodies. I watched them disappear over the bare trees, heading somewhere warmer, somewhere more welcoming. Then I pulled out my phone and called the number back. Judith Collins, Safety Records. This is Troy Renwick. You left a message about Building C documentation. Yes, Mr. Renwick. Owen mentioned you might be interested in reviewing the internal incident logs. We have quite a bit of material that was never included in the official reports submitted to OSHA. Why not? She paused. That's a good question. According to Owen, there were concerns about proper filing procedures during that period. Some incidents were logged internally but never formally reported. For legal reasons, I can't speculate on why. Can I get copies? You can. Since you were directly involved as an affected worker, you have a right to access your exposure records. When would you like to pick them up? Today, if possible. I'll have them ready by 4. I hung up and sat there for another moment, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly. Not revenge. Something colder and more deliberate. Clarity, maybe. The understanding that if they wouldn't take me seriously based on my word, I'd make them take me seriously based on documentation they couldn't argue with. Evidence, facts, professional statements, things that couldn't be dismissed or rolled away with casual smirks. The afternoon was getting colder. I stood up and headed back to my truck, already planning my next steps. Linda Halpern's office was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and printer toner. Nothing fancy, nothing pretentious. Just functional space for a lawyer who did good work and didn't charge like she worked in one of those glass towers downtown. The walls were lined with law books that looked actually used, their spines cracked and pages marked. Real tools, not decoration. I'd known Linda for years, back from when we'd both volunteered at the community center. She'd helped me with some paperwork when I retired from the plant, making sure the medical documentation was properly filed, that I got all the benefits I was entitled to. Now she sat across from me, reading through the stack of documents I'd brought, her reading glasses perched on her nose. This is extensive, she said finally, looking up. You kept all of this? I kept everything. Seemed like a good idea at the time, though I wasn't sure why. She flipped through another page. It was. These exposure reports alone show a clear pattern of unsafe conditions, and you've matched them chronologically with your medical records. That's smart documentation. Owen Granger, he was a safety inspector at the plant before he moved to the regional office. He's getting me more. Internal logs that weren't filed properly with OSHA. Documentation showing what management knew and when. Linda nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. What do you want to do with all this, Troy? What's your goal here? Good question. The one I'd been asking myself for days, turning it over in my mind like a puzzle piece I couldn't quite fit into place. I want them to understand, I said carefully. My family. I want them to understand that this isn't me being difficult or making things up. This is a real condition with real causes, and I want them to take it seriously. Actually seriously, not just saying they will and then lighting candles anyway. That's reasonable, but documentation like this, it can be used for more than just family conversations. She tapped the papers. There are legal avenues here, settlement claims against the plant, disability protections, workers' compensation reviews. This kind of evidence could be valuable. I'm not looking to sue anyone. The plant's under new management now anyway. Different company. Most of the people responsible have retired or moved on. I'm not suggesting you should pursue litigation, but I am suggesting you protect yourself, legally and financially. She pulled the bank statements I'd included toward her. These show significant financial support provided to your son over the years, substantial amounts, with no repayment agreement or even acknowledgement that repayment might be expected. He's my son. I helped him when he needed it. That's what parents do. Of course, but you also need to make sure your own future is secure, especially if the relationship with your family is strained, especially if they're not showing you the respect and consideration you deserve. I sat back in the chair. The office was quiet except for the hum of the heating system and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Outside the window, I could see the parking lot, people coming and going with their own problems, their own complicated lives. What would protection look like? I asked. Linda pulled out a legal pad and started making notes in her precise handwriting. First, we establish clear boundaries on any future financial support. We create documentation of what was given in the past, with a formal statement that you're no longer in a position to provide that level of assistance. Not won't, can't. It's about capacity, not willingness. Second, we create a comprehensive medical file that can be referenced if anyone questions the legitimacy of your respiratory condition. Not just your records, but supporting documentation from the plant, from safety inspectors, from medical professionals. An unassailable record. Third, we make sure your own assets are protected. Accounts, retirement funds, anything that could be claimed or contested. We establish legal boundaries that make it clear what's yours and what's not available for others' use. Contested by who? I asked, though I already knew the answer. By anyone who might feel entitled to them. Family members who've grown accustomed to access, who've come to see your resources as extensions of their own. I thought about that. Evan had never asked for direct access to my bank account, but he'd asked for plenty over the years, always with the assumption that I'd say yes. Always with that tone that suggested refusal would be unreasonable, even cruel. How long would this take? I asked. The basic framework? A week? Maybe 2? Depends on how quickly we can gather supporting documentation. But Troy? She paused, looking at me over her glasses. Can I ask what prompted this? What finally made you decide to take action? I told her about the dinner. The candles deliberately lit despite my explicit request, despite their knowledge of my condition. The eye-rolling and smirking. The conversation I'd overheard downtown where they turned my medical issues into entertainment. The texts demanding I apologize for overreacting. She listened without interrupting, her expression neutral but attentive. That's disrespectful, she said when I finished. More than disrespectful. It's dismissive of your legitimate needs. But is it worth taking legal action? I need to ask that clearly. I don't want legal action against them, and I want them to realize I'm not joking. This isn't a personality quirk or an overreaction. This is consequence from years of sacrifice. Real consequence with real causes. Then we make that clear. Professionally, officially, with documentation they can't dismiss or argue with. She made another note. And we make sure you're protected going forward, regardless of how they respond. I left her office an hour later with a list of items to gather and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the next week. The October afternoon was cold and getting colder, the sky threatening rain that smelled like it would arrive before evening. I drove to the library, my mind already working through what came next. The study room on the second floor was empty. I'd reserved it online that morning, wanting a quiet space where I could spread out and work without interruption. The library had that particular silence that comes from being surrounded by information, not empty quiet, but the dense quiet of accumulated knowledge. I set up my laptop and the files I'd brought, then started searching through public databases. Chemical plant safety violations, 1995 to 2015. Settlement programs for affected workers. disability benefits for respiratory conditions caused by occupational exposure, medical research on chronic chemical exposure, legal precedents for workplace-related health conditions. The information was all there, buried in government databases and industry reports and academic journals. You just had to know where to look and have the patience to dig through bureaucratic language. I took notes carefully, methodically. This wasn't about anger anymore, wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about establishing facts, creating a record that couldn't be questioned or diminished, building a foundation solid enough that it couldn't be shaken by eye-rolling or dismissive comments. By the time the library closed at 6, I had pages of information, exposure limits that had been regularly exceeded at the plant, safety equipment that was supposed to be provided but wasn't, medical monitoring that was required by law but never implemented, a clear trail of negligence that explained exactly why my lungs didn't work the way they used to. Owen called while I was driving home through streets already dark. "Judith got you the files?" "She did. I picked them up this afternoon. Haven't had a chance to go through them all yet." "Good. Troy, I need to tell you something. Evan called me today." I pulled into my parking space and turned off the engine, sitting in the dark cab of my truck. "What did he want?" "He wanted to know if I'd talked to you. Said the family is really worried now. Said you're not returning calls and they don't understand why you're so upset over one dinner." Those were his words. "One dinner." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd seen you, but that what you chose to share with me was your business, that you were an adult capable of making your own decisions." Owen paused. He tried to play it off like you were overreacting. Made some comment about you always being sensitive about health stuff, about how you make things bigger than they need to be. "Sensitive?" "Yeah, I didn't engage with that. But Troy, you should know. They're not taking this seriously. They think you're having some kind of episode, some kind of overreaction that'll blow over if they just give you time." "Maybe I am having an episode of clarity." Owen laughed, short and sharp. "Fair enough. Listen, if you need anything else, documentation, a witness statement, a professional reference, whatever, you let me know. What they did at that dinner wasn't okay. And what they're doing now, dismissing your legitimate concerns, that's not okay either." After we hung up, I sat in my truck for a while longer. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few cars scattered under the streetlights. My apartment building rose above me, modest and unremarkable. Home, such as it was. They think you're having some kind of episode. Let them think that. Let them assume I'd eventually come around, apologize for making a scene, go back to being the convenient father who helped when needed and stayed quiet otherwise, the father who understood, the father who didn't make waves. I pulled out the envelope Judith had given me that afternoon. It was thick, heavy with years of documentation. Internal safety logs, Owen had said, material that showed just how bad conditions had really been. I opened it and started reading by the dim dome light. Building C, June 2003. Ventilation failure during extended production shift. Exposure levels exceeded OSHA permissible limits by 400%. Multiple workers reported respiratory distress. Incident logged internally but not filed with regulatory authorities. Management decision documented. Production priorities override temporary worker discomfort. Building C, September 2005. Chemical leak contained but cleanup delayed 72 hours due to production schedule. Workers continued exposure during delay period. Medical complaints dismissed as unrelated. Internal memo notes. No clear causal link between complaints and workplace environment can be established without admitting liability. Building C, January 2007. Routine safety inspection bypassed due to production deadlines. Multiple violations noted in internal audit but not corrected. Follow-up inspection postponed indefinitely. Building C, April 2009. Ventilation system partial failure. Temporary fixes implemented. Permanent repairs deemed cost prohibitive. Workers instructed to use personal protective equipment that safety manager noted was inadequate for exposure levels present. Page after page, year after year, a systematic failure to protect the people doing the work, a deliberate choice to prioritize production over safety, profit over health. And it wasn't just negligence, it was documented negligence. People knew, people chose to do nothing. People decided that worker health was an acceptable sacrifice for efficiency. I closed the envelope carefully. My hands were steady. My breathing was calm, despite the tightness that always lurked in my chest these days. Tomorrow I'd meet with Julia Mercer, the accountant Linda had recommended. She'd help me organize my financial records, create a clear picture of exactly how much I'd given and what I had left. Put numbers to the generosity that had become expected rather than appreciated. And then I'd start building my case. Not a legal case. I'd meant what I said about not suing anyone, but a case nonetheless. A presentation of facts that couldn't be argued with, documentation that couldn't be dismissed, professional statements that would force them to confront reality instead of their comfortable dismissal of it. Let them think I was overreacting. Let them think this would blow over. They'd find out otherwise soon enough. Julia Mercer's office smelled like coffee and paper, that particular combination that came from spending days surrounded by financial documents. She was younger than I expected, maybe 50, with reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck and a desk covered in organized chaos. Files stacked precisely, post-it notes in different colors marking various sections, a computer monitor that showed multiple spreadsheets open simultaneously. "Owen Granger referred you," she said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. "Said you needed help organizing financial documentation for personal protection purposes." "I do, and I need to understand my situation clearly. Not what I think it is, but what it actually is." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Show me what you've got." I laid out the bank statements, check copies, loan documents, receipts from various transactions, everything I'd gathered over the past week, sorting through boxes and filing cabinets, reconstructing years of financial history. She went through it methodically, making notes, occasionally asking questions, entering numbers into her computer. "This is over 15 years of transactions," she said after a while, looking up from her screen. "You've provided substantial financial support to your son over this period. I helped when he needed it. That's what parents do. Did he ever pay any of this back? Any of it?" "No. It wasn't structured as loans. Just help, money when he needed it." Julia looked at me over her glasses, her expression carefully neutral. "Help adds up. By my preliminary calculation, based on what you've shown me and accounting for inflation, you've provided approximately $83,000 in direct financial support over this period. That doesn't count smaller amounts under $100 that might not have been documented. It doesn't count indirect support like co-signing loans or providing housing during transitions." The number hung in the air between us. I'd known it was significant. You don't write that many checks without noticing. But seeing it stated that way, calculated precisely and presented as fact, made it real in a different way. "Can that be recovered?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Not easily. Without written agreements, there's no legal obligation for repayment. These weren't loans in the legal sense. They were gifts, generous gifts." She pulled up another spreadsheet. "But they can be documented for other purposes, demonstrating your financial history, showing your past generosity, establishing why future support isn't feasible, creating a professional record that can't be argued with. I'm not looking to bankrupt him or make his life difficult. I'm not suggesting you should, but you need to protect yourself. Your retirement income is modest. You have ongoing medical expenses related to your respiratory condition. You can't sustain that level of giving indefinitely. Actually, you couldn't sustain it at all. You were drawing down savings to provide that support." She spent the next hour going through my accounts with meticulous attention to detail: income, expenses, medical costs, projected needs. By the end, she'd created a clear financial picture, one that showed I'd been generous to the point of compromising my own security. Past the point, actually. I'd been risking my future stability to fund their present comfort. "Here's my recommendation," she said, printing out several documents. "We document everything. Create a formal statement of your financial position and boundaries. If your son requests help in the future, you have a professional basis for declining. It's not personal, it's mathematical. You literally cannot afford to continue that pattern." "Will he see it that way?" "That's not really the relevant question, Troy. The relevant question is whether you can afford to keep supporting him at previous levels, and the answer, based on these numbers, is definitively no. You've depleted savings that should have been preserved for your own needs. Future requests need to be declined for your own financial survival." I left her office with folders of organized documentation and a follow-up appointment scheduled. The afternoon was cold and bright, one of those October days where the sky was painfully blue and the air hurt to breathe. Or maybe that was just my lungs, always sensitive to temperature changes now. My phone had been quiet lately. Fewer calls, fewer texts. Either they were giving me space like I'd requested, or they'd given up trying to reach me. I wasn't sure which, and I wasn't sure I cared anymore. I stopped at the cafe on Elm Street for coffee. The same corner booth was empty, like it was waiting for me. Maybe it was my booth now. Maybe the staff had started thinking of it that way. That's where the quiet older guy sits, the one who always orders black coffee and doesn't talk to anyone. I sat down with the folders Julia had prepared and started reviewing them. numbers in neat columns, dates and amounts. A timeline of generosity that had gone unacknowledged, transformed from gift into expectation somewhere along the way. The door opened and Kara walked in. I looked up, genuinely surprised. She saw me immediately, probably knew I'd be here, probably asked around until she found my routine, and walked over with that careful expression people use when they are approaching something fragile. "Can I sit?" she asked, her hand already on the back of the chair. I gestured to the empty seat. She sat down slowly, her jacket still zipped up, like she wasn't planning to stay long. "You haven't returned my calls," she said. Statement, not question. "I told you I needed space." "It's been almost 2 weeks, Dad. That's more than space. That's disappearing. That's cutting us all off." I took a sip of coffee, letting the heat burn my tongue. "I'm right here, same place I've always been, just not at your immediate disposal. You know what I mean." She paused, looking down at the table. "Evan's really worried. So is Marissa. They feel terrible about the dinner." "Are they?" "Yes. They didn't realize how serious your breathing thing was. They thought you were just being particular about sense, not that it was a medical issue." "My breathing thing." I set down my coffee with deliberate care. "Kara, I've explained this multiple times over multiple years. It's not a thing. It's not a preference. It's a diagnosed medical condition caused by documented occupational exposure. I have evidence from doctors, from the plant, from safety inspectors. None of this is news. I know it's real. I believe you. I'm just saying they didn't understand how much it bothered you. They didn't understand because they didn't want to understand. There's a fundamental difference between ignorance and willful dismissal." She looked uncomfortable, her hands fidgeting with the zipper pull on her jacket. "Dad, I think you're making this bigger than it needs to be. It was one dinner, one mistake. Can't we just move past it?" "Move past it. That's interesting." I pulled out my phone and showed her the photo I'd taken of Julia's summary page, the one with the total in bold at the bottom. "You see this number?" She looked at the screen, her eyes widening slightly. $83,000, I continued. "That's how much money I've given your brother over the years. Not loaned, given. Because that's what fathers do. They help their children even when it compromises their own security. Dad, that doesn't count what I spent on his college, which was substantial. That doesn't count the times I worked overtime because he needed something. That doesn't count the medical expenses I put off because helping him seemed more important. That's just direct financial transfers after he supposedly became an adult." "I didn't know it was that much." "Why would you? Nobody was tracking it. Nobody was acknowledging it. It was just expected. Troy will help. Troy always helps. That's what he does. I understand you've been generous. And when I ask for basic consideration about my health, not money, not sacrifice, just don't light candles that make it hard for me to breathe, your brother smirks. His wife rolls her eyes. And you sit there saying nothing. You watch them dismiss me, and you say nothing." Kara looked down at her hands. "You're right. I should have said something. I'm sorry. I don't need apologies. I need them to take me seriously. I need acknowledgement that my condition is real, that it has real causes, that I'm not being difficult or dramatic, and they won't give me that. So I'm taking steps to make sure they have to face reality." "What kind of steps?" I closed the folders on the table. Legal documentation, financial boundaries, professional statements from doctors, lawyers, safety inspectors, accountants, evidence that establishes facts they can't argue with or dismiss. "You're involving lawyers? Against your own family?" "I'm protecting myself. There's a significant difference. I'm creating records that make it clear what my medical situation actually is and what I can and cannot afford to continue doing." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is crazy, Dad. You're talking about treating your family like adversaries, like enemies. They treated me like I was disposable, like my needs were negotiable, like my medical condition was something they could dismiss whenever it was inconvenient. I'm just making sure they understand the consequences of that choice. Evan's your son, your only son, Marissa's family now. You can't just—" "I can't just what?" I kept my voice level, but something cold had entered it. "Expect respect? Expect basic consideration for a legitimate health issue? Expect acknowledgement for decades of support? What exactly am I not allowed to expect, Kara?" She stared at me for a long moment, her face shifting through emotions I couldn't quite read. Confusion, hurt, maybe anger. Then she turned and walked out without another word. I sat there alone with my coffee and my folders, watching through the window as she got in her car and drove away. The cafe around me continued its quiet afternoon rhythm, people coming and going, lives intersecting briefly and then separating, everyone focused on their own concerns. My phone buzzed. Text from Evan. Kara said you're talking to lawyers and accountants. What the hell is going on? Call me. I didn't respond. Just set the phone face down on the table and finished my coffee. That evening, back in my apartment, I laid everything out on the kitchen table. Medical records organized chronologically. Exposure logs showing exactly what I'd been breathing at that plant. Safety violations documented by inspectors. Financial statements proving years of support. Legal documents from Linda's office establishing boundaries and protections. Organized, systematic, undeniable. A knock on my door surprised me. I looked through the peephole and saw Sage standing there, his hands in his pockets, looking uncomfortable. I opened the door. Sage. Troy, can I come in? I stepped aside and let him enter. He looked around my apartment. He'd never been here before, none of them had, taking in the modest space, the simple furniture, the organized shelves, the life I'd built in careful solitude. What can I do for you? I asked. Kara's really upset. She said you're planning something involving lawyers and exposing the family publicly. I'm not exposing anyone. I'm documenting facts about my own life and health. Facts about what, exactly? I gestured to the table, to the carefully organized stacks of papers. About why my lungs don't work right. About how much I've supported Evan financially over the years. About the reality of my medical and financial situation. Facts that can't be argued with or dismissed. Sage looked at the papers spread across the table, his expression hard to read. Why? What's the point of all this? The point is respect. The point is acknowledgement. The point is showing them that I'm not making things up or being difficult or overreacting. I have a legitimate condition with documented causes, and I've been generous to the point of compromising my own security. And when I needed the smallest consideration, just don't light scented candles that trigger my symptoms, I was treated like a joke. So this is revenge. This is clarity. This is establishing reality. This is making sure they can't keep dismissing me. He shook his head slowly. You're going to destroy your relationship with your son, with all of us. My son destroyed it when he smirked at my breathing problems, when he turned my medical condition into entertainment at a downtown coffee cart, when he decided his wife's convenience was more important than my ability to breathe. I'm just making sure everyone understands exactly what happened and why. Sage left shortly after, his face troubled. I locked the door behind him and returned to my table, to my documentation, to my carefully assembled truth. The next day, Linda called with an update. Everything's ready. Documents are filed and notarized. Your financial protections are in place. Medical documentation is organized, verified, and backed by professional statements, whenever you're ready to proceed. There's a community event next week, I said. Family Appreciation Night at the community center on Tuesday evening. Will they be there? They will, the whole family. It's the kind of community thing they always attend, looking good in public, being seen as upstanding citizens. And you want to use that as the venue for your presentation? I want them all to hear it at once. Official, public, witnessed, undeniable. Linda was quiet for a moment. That's a bold approach. Very bold. Are you absolutely sure? I'm sure. They won't listen in private. They'll dismiss anything I say one-on-one, but in public, with documentation, with professional witnesses, they'll have to actually hear it, actually acknowledge it. Then we'll be ready. I'll prepare presentation copies of the key documents. Owen Granger confirmed he'll provide testimony about the plant conditions. Julia's financial summary is complete and documented. You'll have everything you need to make your case. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and thought about what was coming. 1 week. 7 days until they'd have to confront the reality they'd been dismissing. 7 days until the careful, organized truth I'd assembled would be presented in a way they couldn't ignore or diminish. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was hot and reactive. This was something colder, something more deliberate. This was justice, maybe, or at least accountability. They'd made their choices. Now they'd understand the consequences. The community center hall smelled like floor polish and old coffee. I arrived 40 minutes early, before anyone else, and took a seat near the back. Linda arrived next, carrying her leather briefcase. She sat down beside me without speaking. Then Julia, with her organized folders. Then Owen, who nodded once before taking a seat 2 rows ahead. The room filled gradually. Families, community members, people I recognized from years of living in this area. And then my family arrived. Evan and Marissa came in first. They saw me immediately. I didn't try to hide, and Evan's expression shifted. Confusion, then something harder. Marissa whispered something to him. He shook his head. Kara and Sage arrived right after. Kara looked pale. She'd called me twice yesterday, begging me not to do this. I hadn't responded. They all sat together, 3 rows from the front. I watched them from the back, these people I'd spent decades protecting. The event coordinator stepped to the microphone. Thank you all for coming to Family Appreciation Night. We have several speakers lined up who want to share stories about what family means to them. She went through the list. Local families talking about gratitude, about support, about being there for each other. Nice stories. Genuine sentiment. And finally, the coordinator said, we have Troy Renwick, who wanted to share some thoughts about family and understanding. I stood up. Evan turned in his seat, his face registering alarm. Marissa's expression was defensive. Kara looked like she might be sick. I walked to the front slowly, steadily, took my position at the podium, looked out at the room full of people. Thank you for letting me speak, I said. My voice was calm, clear. I want to talk about respect, about what happens when families take each other for granted. Evan shifted uncomfortably. Kara stared at me like she was watching something break. 2 weeks ago, I attended a family dinner. My daughter-in-law had lit scented candles. I asked her to put them out because the fragrance bothers my breathing. She refused. My son found it amusing. The room was quiet now. People were listening. I have a respiratory condition. It's real. It's permanent. And it's the direct result of 26 years working in a chemical plant where safety protocols weren't followed. I have documentation proving this. I nodded to Linda. She walked to the podium with the first folder. These are exposure reports from the plant, I said, opening the folder. They show repeated ventilation failures, chemical leaks, and safety violations. They show I was exposed to hazardous materials at levels well above legal limits for years. I accepted the next folder from Linda. These are my medical records. They document progressive respiratory damage that started during my time at the plant. They show my condition isn't something I'm making up. It's diagnosed, it's documented, it's real. Evan's face had gone red. Marissa was looking at the floor. Owen Granger was a safety inspector at the plant, I continued. Owen stood. He has access to internal logs that were never officially filed. Owen, would you explain? Owen walked to the podium. The logs show systematic failures to protect workers, Owen said. Troy Renwick worked in Building C, which had the highest incident rate. During his tenure, there were 47 documented exposure events. None were properly reported to authorities. The conditions he worked in caused his respiratory damage. That's documented fact. Owen returned to his seat. I took the microphone again. I worked in those conditions to provide for my family, for my son. I accepted another folder from Linda. These are financial records showing support I've given over 15 years, over $83,000 in direct assistance. College costs aren't included, neither are countless smaller amounts. I looked directly at Evan. I never asked for repayment. That's what fathers do. They help their children. But when I needed help, when I needed simple consideration about my health, I was mocked. I was dismissed. I was treated like I was being difficult. Marissa was crying now. Evan had his arm around her, staring at nothing. Julia Mercer is an accountant, I continued. Julia stood. She's reviewed my financial situation. Julia? Julia walked to the front. Mr. Renwick's financial support of his son was generous to the point of compromising his own security. His retirement income is modest. His medical expenses are ongoing. He cannot sustain that level of giving without risking his future stability. So, I'm not going to, I said. Future financial assistance isn't possible. That's not anger. That's mathematics. I closed the folder. Linda Halpern is my lawyer. She's helped me establish legal protections and boundaries. Everything I've shared tonight is documented, verified, and on record. Linda stood, holding a final document. Mr. Renwick has filed a formal statement documenting his medical condition, its causes, and his financial position. This has been notarized and placed on legal record. Any future disputes will be resolved with reference to this documentation. I took the microphone one last time. I don't need apologies. I need recognition. Recognition that my condition is real. Recognition that I sacrificed for this family. Recognition that respect goes both ways. I stepped away from the podium. The room was completely silent. Evan sat frozen, his face pale. Marissa had both hands over her face. Kara looked like she might faint. I walked down the center aisle, past rows of witnesses, past my family, who didn't move or speak. Linda, Julia, and Owen followed me out. The parking lot was dark. My truck sat under a streetlight. My phone was already buzzing. I pulled it out and saw Evan's name, then Marissa, then Kara. I turned the phone off and got in my truck. Behind me, the community center doors opened. Evan stood there, phone pressed to his ear, trying to reach me. Marissa appeared beside him, then Kara. I started the engine and drove away, leaving them standing there with their phones and their shock and the undeniable truth. The night air was clear and cold. My breathing was steady. For the first time in years, I could actually breathe.